You're listening to the Pink Tax Podcast, where being a woman costs more and we've got the receipts. From overpriced razors to underpaid roles, we're talking money, power, and the price of showing up. Let's get into it. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Pink Tax Podcast. I'm your host, Janine, and today we're diving into the cost of being a woman. Now, I am the author of the book called The Pink Tax, and in it I talk about just how challenging it is to build wealth and advance in a society and systems that are kind of pitted against women building that wealth. And I wanted to dive into what it actually costs to be a woman, because I estimate that it costs women about $2 million over the course of their life just to exist. And I'm going to break down how I got to that number in today's episode. So I am so excited that you're here, either listening or watching, and I wanted to dive right into it. Now, one of the things that we know to be true is that there is a wage gap. And regardless of what men on the internet say in my comment section, it actually does exist. And depending on where you are in the world, the wage gap can vary quite a bit. So in Canada, we're sitting at about 84 cents on the dollar, and that is the wage gap for white women. And I think it's important that we always include an intersectional lens and we talk about it, because many times there's not that much data collected for intersectionality. And if we don't talk about it, we fail to actually drive change forward and cause companies to start caring about that data. So white women earn 84 cents on the dollar. Women of color earn around 62 cents on the dollar. Any level of intersectionality we're adding, that just gets worse. So if you are disabled or neurodivergent or part of the LGBTQ2S+ community, it's going to make that wage gap worse. Once we understand the wage gap, and like I said, the wage gap is different in many different areas all around the world. And I have my notes for this episode because there's a lot of statistics and I wanted to make sure I got them all right. So in Iceland, the wage gap is probably the smallest in the world at about 94 cents on the dollar. And in Australia, it's about 78 cents on the dollar. Italy, it's sitting at about 70 cents on the dollar. So I like to share a few statistics so you can get an understanding of what's kind of happening throughout the world. But what happens with the wage gap is women have less money. And when we have less money, it means that we don't ultimately end up with more money to save and invest. And through being a woman, there is also costs associated with things like the pink tax that further hinder our ability to save and invest. And that translates into a wealth gap. And the wealth gap is even worse than the wage gap. The wealth gap is sitting at about 30 cents on the dollar. And that, again, is for white women globally, and women of color sit at about 2%. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. And I think one of the driving factors, obviously, is the wage gap. And there's lots of things that we can do as companies and as people in society when it comes to the wage gap, but there has to be the will to do that. And unfortunately, I think with like the rollback of DE&I this year, maybe due to the administration south of the border, it can be really challenging to actually further that in your companies when women's groups aren't being funded, when there are those rollbacks of those promises that companies made. We have to find the companies that actually care. And what's interesting about legislation is sometimes it works, and I would argue sometimes it doesn't work. And when we just have legislation with no accountability, I don't think it works. So in Iceland, for example, companies have to publish their wage gap data. And if they don't do that, there are actually daily fines. And so that, to me, shows that they're actually caring and pushing that agenda forward for those companies. When I look at places like the UK, there are wage gap reporting laws. Like, you can go look it up. There's lots of tech companies that operate globally. You can go look up their wage gaps in the UK. But in many circumstances, that wage gap, nothing changes year over year. And that can be really, really frustrating when we continue to see those wage gaps over and over again, and no one is really making any change and taking any action to close those wage gaps. So it's something that we need to be aware of, absolutely, but we also need to take action on and hold the people in those companies accountable. And I think we can do that through things like what Iceland has, where there's punitive fines if you maybe don't report on your wage gap, or you need to take action to close that wage gap. And if it continually gets worse, maybe there's another mechanism that we can use around maybe fines again to stop companies from doing that and stop companies from not caring. Another thing that we can look at is pay transparency laws. We've started to see that here in Canada, in Ontario and BC, but again, they say like you have to share the range for the roles you apply for, but sometimes companies will have ranges of like $50,000 to $150,000, and that's not really a range. That's just like kind of that get out of jail free card. Like they want to say that they're in compliance with the laws, but they don't actually want to take it seriously. If it was kind of up to me, I would say like companies need to post a range in it plus or minus 10% of what the actual kind of middle salary is. So those are a couple of examples that we can, I guess, legislate, but internally companies also need to make sure that they're looking at their gender pay gaps and understanding how they can actually manage those, because oftentimes, and I've shared this in previous episodes, there are gaps and you hire someone new in for a role and you hire them higher than a person that is currently working in that role, which happened to me when I was at an accounting firm. I was paid $13,000 less than that I was training. And I think, that really hurts culture within an organization. And I think companies need to critically look at that. I worked with a gal at one point in my career who she actually went to her manager and was like, hey, I just want to make sure that I'm being compensated fairly. So can you go look at everyone on the team and make sure that there's no gender pay gap? And he came back and gave her a $10,000 raise. So I think also asking questions and getting curious is a really good way of trying to move that agenda forward. If we just go into these meetings and are like, hey, I'm being paid less, you need to fix this, I'm not sure that will actually do anything. I would love for it to actually make change, but I don't know if it will. And so asking really curious questions, presenting your managers with data, and those are things that we can do as individuals. But as managers and as leaders in companies, I think if you have a team, it's also on you to make sure that everyone on your team is being compensated appropriately and fairly, and that there aren't any gender wage gaps. And I'll give you one more example. When I was in the tech space, I worked at a company and there was different internal levels. I think most companies have that. Anyways, we had 8 people on our team, and all of the men, there was 4 men, 4 women, all of the men were seniors and all of the women were like staff levels. And that in itself is its own kind of gender wage gap, because we were all doing the same job, but the salary bands were different depending on kind of which group you were in. And obviously the seniors had a higher band. So that was something that I brought up and continued to advocate for during my time at that company. But I think as managers, that's something we also need to be aware of, is like, who's getting promoted, or are we hiring men in at higher levels, which is kind of what happened in this situation. And what does that do to a woman's kind of long-term earning potential? Okay, so we see this wage gap. We know that it exists. And then there's all these things that kind of happen to women over the course of their life that just really cost them a lot of money. And one of them is the pink tax. Now, the pink tax is the gendered pricing difference between men's and women's product. And I talk about it actually a little bit in my book, not a ton, but it is something that is very real. Newer research has come out since I wrote the book, but they're estimating that it costs women $180,000 over the course of their their life, not their career, $188,000 over their life in pink taxed items. So walk into any grocery store, any pharmacy, the razor that is pink is going to be more expensive. Or the shaving cream by the same company for men and women will have the same price, but the women's volume will be lower. These are examples of the pink tax. Dry cleaning. I do not understand how a woman's shirt that's usually like less fabric because it's usually smaller, woman's dress shirt is more expensive than a man's dress shirt. So there's so many examples of these things. Children's toys, clothing, all of these things add up over the course of our life. And in that, it ends up costing us close to $200,000 in kind of pink tax items. So what can we do about this? We can talk about it. We can call companies out that are doing this. But again, I think there needs to be legislation that impacts women in a positive way and tells these companies that they can't do it. But there has to be a reporting mechanism. And again, there has to be that like level of accountability. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the pink tax. The next area I wanted to draw your attention to is what we call the grooming gap. And the grooming gap costs women, they're estimating 55 minutes per day and $225,000 over the course of their life. And so the grooming gap is all of the expenses that women pay just to kind of exist in society when it comes to getting their hair done or their makeup or the beauty standards that we hold women to that we do not hold men to. Women spend a lot of time and a lot of money on these things. So things like skincare and face creams, all of those are going to add into the cost of being a woman. And so we have the pink tax at $188,000. We have the grooming gap at $225,000. We're starting to see how expensive it is to simply just exist in the world. And, I know that some people will say like, oh, well then just don't wear any makeup, don't do your hair. And I think that if that is not for you, that is totally fine. But unfortunately, we are also in a society where people who do kind of subject themselves to normal, if normal is the right word, beauty standards, they're oftentimes the ones that get promoted. They're ones that get asked to do things. They're more successful. And so I think it's like a catch-22. I don't know if we can put it on women so much as maybe we can just like understand what's going on there. And hopefully women start to not need or not want to spend as much money on some of those things. But again, it is something that we've put on women. And I don't know if I have like a good answer as to like what they can actually do to stop having that expense. So we have the pink tax, we have the grooming gap. And then I also wanted to talk about period poverty and kind of the cost associated with menstruation for people who menstruate. And I was doing some research on this, and in many countries, there are sales taxes still on menstruation products. Canada got rid of that in 2015, so that's really positive. But there are definitely states in the US that charge sales tax on these items and other countries in the world that do this as well. So I think that has to go. Absolutely. But also I think menstruation products should be free because over the course of a woman's life, she ends up spending close to $18,000 on menstruation products. And there's definitely a range depending on the types of products you use. But the fact that we are basically just saying like, you have to pay this amount of money. And I've seen like some things on TikTok where it's like horrendous pricing for tampons in like an airport. And I think that that really does hurt women. And I mean, when you walk into a bathroom, like a public bathroom, you don't pay for your toilet paper. You don't bring your own toilet paper or Kleenex. So I don't know why we're making women purchase tampons. And, when they talk about, well, if we made tampons free, women would just hoard them. I'm like, go talk to any woman, and I guarantee you the last thing she wants to hoard is tampons, right? Women are always willing to like share a menstrual product like with someone who doesn't have one if they're caught in a situation. And I think that women will not take more than they need when it comes to menstruation. And I think that is like such a cop-out. But yeah, that one really shocked me that it added up to kind of close to $20,000 over the course of a woman's life. And that also doesn't include that sales tax component. So I think we absolutely need to change the sales tax globally. And then I think period products should be free, because there's also a lot of people in period poverty who can't afford those products. And that is really heartbreaking. So we have just all of these costs adding up. Another, I guess, if we want to call it a pink tax, we kind of can, but it is the tax on apparel being brought into our countries. So when you look at, and this is kind of pre all the chaos in tariffs in 2025, but even before that, women's clothing were being taxed from a tariff lens more than men's. And so a tariff is just a tax we put on something that we import, and then that gets kind of rolled into the cost of something. So we bring in a shirt from China, we apply a 10% tariff, and so maybe the person bought, or the company bought the shirt for $10, and then they're going to add on that 10% tariff, that's another $1. So now their cost is $11. They're probably going to sell the shirt for $20. So it does get passed on to the consumer. But what was really interesting when I was pulling the research is men's clothing import tariff rate into the US is 12 to 14% on average. Women's is 15 to 17%. And a lot of times these are coming from like the same factories, made out of the same things. They might even be the same shirt, just a smaller size. And so this costs women and costs consumers $2,500 over their lifetime. So a little bit of a smaller number, but nonetheless, it's still there, and it's still being passed on to women when they are purchasing clothing, which is, again, insane. My son loves like different colors and is really into pinks and purples. So oftentimes we will go to the little girls section and pick out a pink shirt or purple leggings. And it is atrocious that it is much more expensive to buy those little girl clothes or little girls leggings than it is to buy the green ones that are the little boys ones and the little boys leggings. And I don't know why we're doing this to women and to girls, because again, they're made out of the same fabric. They're coming from the same factory, probably in a third world country. So that is another thing that I think we could absolutely advocate for change on. And I don't think a lot of people know that. Of course, going along with the cost of being a woman, there is birth control. And I was looking at some figures, and kind of, again, depending on the type of birth control you choose over the course of your life, it can cost anywhere up to about $1,800 a year, which if you think about the number of years where you actually need birth control, and this is not including like HRT when you get into perimenopause and menopause, $60,000 over their lifetime in birth control products. And again, I think these should be free. And I think when you compare all these birth control products to the price of, let's say, condoms, it's nowhere near the same price, and women are just paying so much more. And again, that's not including like getting to that menopause age and stage and maybe needing hormone replacements or other things that I haven't included in this research. So you can probably add that on too. So we're really starting to get to a high number here. And kind of the last consumer one I wanted to talk about before we get into kind of earning potential is car ownership. So there's been a lot of studies that actually show when women go to car dealerships or get mechanical services, they're quoted higher numbers, which is beyond frustrating. I was in a news article on this. I can't remember if it was CTV or CBC, but we talked about kind of this as its own pink tax and its impact on women. And on average, it costs women about $142 more per year based on the research that I did when it comes to car maintenance. And that's not including like buying a car at the dealership. This ends up to be close to $8,000 over the course of their life. And that is not an insignificant amount of money. So we've got the pink tax, we've got the grooming gap, we've got the cost of menstrual products, birth control, tariffs on apparel, and now car ownership. So all of those numbers added up together are $502,000. And that's just in like consumption over the course of a woman's life. So she's being paid less, and then she has all of these costs associated with her life. So it's no wonder women have less ability to save and ultimately invest. Okay, then I wanted to talk about like the actual penalties that women face in their earnings potentials. So these are kind of the losses over their career. So we talked a little bit about the wage gap and what that looks like and why it's so important. There are estimates that it can cost between $400,000 and $1 million over the course of a woman's life, because she's just at that lower salary. And then, your next raise is based on that first salary, and it just compounds over the lifetime of a woman. And there are wage gaps all the way up to the top. I remember an article coming out years ago that showed compensation at one of the top law firms in Canada. And it was, again, probably about $100,000 difference between the highest paid female attorney and the highest paid male attorney, and they're doing the same work. So we know that this impacts women, and we know that over the course of a woman's career, it's going to cost her $400,000 to $1 million in just wage loss. And then, of course, this doesn't include the impact that it has on women's retirement savings. So if you think about your salary and you think about government benefits, when you contribute to CPP, that amount is based on your kind of highest earning years. And so what we often see is women get less CPP and have less money in their pensions or in their retirement savings. Again, because many times employers will match, like 3% match of your salary, but if you have that lower salary, that's just a lower number already. So we're estimating that women lose about $325,000 in retirement contributions, pensions, reduced CPP benefits, and this can also be due to leaving the workforce for a period of time, like when you're raising kids or when you give birth, if you choose to do that. So this impacts women quite a bit over the course of their retirement because they just have less money. So we have the wage gap. I'm going to use like probably $400,000. I'll go on the lower end. And then the pension gap and the retirement gap, which is about $325,000. So we're starting to see how quickly this number can add up. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the motherhood penalty. And so we also know that there is a penalty to your earnings when you become a mom. Becoming a parent, becoming a mom specifically, is probably one of the worst financial decisions you can make. Again, I'm a mom of an almost 5-year-old. I am not saying don't have kids. I love having my son. I would not trade it for the world. And there are also real implications that go along with being a mom. And so it's estimated that it's about 4% per year that you reduce your wages once you've had a child. And then there's, of course, the fatherhood bonus or the fatherhood benefit, where men are actually paid more because they're seen as caretakers. They're seen as needing to provide for their family. And so this costs women lifetime earnings of about $500,000. So we can see just how quickly this happens. And I'll share another story. I was pregnant in the pandemic and was up for promotion. And they probably would never say this, but I was passed over for that promotion after I told them I was pregnant. And then I was passed over while I was on mat leave. And then I was passed over the first cycle in coming back from said mat leave. And it was always, the conversation, oh, you didn't work the full year. Oh, just how our cycles ended up falling for promotions and raises. But that was 3 years that I was passed over for that promotion, again, due to becoming a parent. And so I can see how quickly it ends up costing women that much money. And there was a court case that was actually just won out in Ontario where this woman, again, came back. It was basically a constructive dismissal where she came back from mat leave and was basically demoted, and she sued and she won. And I think it is a good reminder that this happens a lot. And this is Moms at Work is a really great organization here in Canada that they do put together this data, and they have been working on surveys and understanding how many women are actually getting passed over for these promotions when they are coming back from mat leave. And it's absolutely insane. So I really do think that we have to think about these from the perspective of policy, but also within our organization. So internal policy, how are we being supportive to new parents? Are we just saying, yep, we're going to forget about you while you're on leave and then you come back and you'll be thrown in? Because I think that's a lot of women's experience. And, I was on maternity leave for 14 months. A lot changes in 14 months. And so that can also be overwhelming to come back to, especially if you don't have the same level of sleep that you did before. We all know kids choose when they sleep sometimes, and that can be really draining as a parent. So I think that within organizations, we absolutely need to set up supportive systems for parents. We need to promote women while they're on leave, and we need to provide parental leave for our male counterparts and make sure that we're actually walking the walk. And if you're a man watching this or listening to this, you're taking that parental leave and showing other males in your company that it's okay. I spoke to someone at one point in my career, and he was going to be a new dad, and he was very excited. And I asked him if he was taking parental leave, and he said no, he didn't want the leave to impact his career. And I was like, oh my God, he got to the point without really understanding that he got to the point. And so from that day forward, I stopped asking men if they were taking leave, and I changed the language to how much leave are you taking? Because I think when we kind of expect men to take leave, then it becomes more normalized. It becomes okay. We do have, I think, 5 weeks here in Canada of protected parental leave for the second partner, but I don't think that's enough. And I think when we look at countries like Sweden, where you absolutely have to split the leave if you want to get additional time, then it becomes the norm. And this is really great for men too, because it allows them to foster relationships with their kids. It allows them to have better mental health because their entire identity isn't tied up in just working. They're also the caretaker. They know how hard it is to run a household. They know the challenges of being the first parent called. I think when we have to start to shift the narrative on that so that we can get rid of this motherhood penalty, because it is costing women so much money. And kind of the last area, actually, no, there are two. There are two more things that I wanted to talk about in terms of kind of earning potential, but shifting away from that in terms of kind of like debt. So there are kind of two areas of debt I wanted to talk about. One is student debt and the other is mortgages. So of student loan borrowers, 60% of them are women, and they on average have 8% more student loan debt than their male counterparts. And this means obviously more debt, but it also means longer repayment times and more interest. So I did a little bit of math because I couldn't find statistics on the exact cost to women over the course of their life or paying back their student loans. But if we compare, let's say, using that math and those averages, $50,000 of student loans. So a woman who has $50,000 of student loans at maybe 5%, she's paying that back over 10 years. I use the Canadian student loan calculator, and her payment is going to be $530 per month, and she's going to pay a total of $13,639 in interest. A man who has 8% less student loan debt, he's going to have $46,000 at that 5%. Over, again, 10 years, his payment is going to be $487, and he's going to pay $12,548 in interest. So the woman is paying an extra $1,000 in interest, which I guess in comparison to all of the numbers we've talked about today is not huge, but it's like one more thing, like another $1,000. The other thing, though, is if he keeps the same payment as her, that $530 I talked about, he's going to be able to pay that debt off 5 months earlier and start kind of deploying his $530 maybe in investing or building wealth in a different way. And so I do think when we look at it from that lens and we look at it from the perspective that women just end up having more student debt, it does cost them more over the course of their life. And, that could be for a whole variety of reasons as to why they have more student debt. I think that would be a really interesting research paper, but I think part of it probably is need more income if they are, let's say, raising a small child while they're going through their program, or maybe they are being paid less in their roles or hold roles while they're working and going to school that just in general pay less or pay minimum wage, because we also know that of minimum wage workers, 60% are women. So if you are just earning less and have less money to pay for your school, then it makes sense that you would kind of have more student loan debt. Okay, last area I want to talk about is the home ownership hurdle. So when we look at credit scores, your credit score is determined by a number of factors, but one of them, and one of the bigger ones, is credit utilization. So what that means is when you have, let's say, $10,000 of credit available, every month it gets reported to TransUnion or Equifax the amount of that $10,000 you're using. So we always want to try and keep our credit utilization below 30%. So if you only have $1,000 of credit, that can be really hard because then you only have $300 that you can kind of use to keep your credit score in that range. So what happens is we get credit based on our credit score and based on our income. So if a man is earning more income, he is probably going to get access to more credit. So let's have an example where there is a man and a woman and they're both buying something that's $3,000. A TV. I don't actually know how much TVs cost. The man has $10,000 available on his credit card and the woman only has $5,000. So that $3,000 on the man's credit card is going to be a utilization of 30%, and on the woman's it's going to be 60%. So at the end of the month, when we go to report those numbers to the credit unions and the credit bureaus, the woman's utilization will be worse and it will impact her credit score in a negative way. And they bought the same TV. In this example, they both spent $3,000. So now she has a lower credit score because she had lower income and couldn't get as much credit as her male counterpart. Then when it comes to mortgages and applying for a mortgage, they will oftentimes, I think all of the time, do a credit check and look at your credit score. And your rate is tied to how good or bad your credit score is. So we see that women will have higher interest rates on their mortgage compared to their male counterparts. And what's driving this? Their ability to get credit in the first place, their income. And so when I was pulling data for this, what we have seen is that single women who get a mortgage, on average, have interest rates that are 0.03% higher than their male counterparts. And again, that sounds like a small number, but on a $500,000 loan, this is going to translate into about $5,000 over the first 10 years of that mortgage. And of course, most mortgages are longer than that. So it's just going to compound. So if we simply just triple that to $15,000 for a 30-year loan, that is another cost associated with being a woman. And that is more money that you're paying just to own kind of the same size home or to have the same size mortgage as your male counterparts. So if we add up this category of things, we have like our debt, our mortgages, our student loan debt, our retirement savings, our motherhood penalty, and our wage gap, we're coming in at $1.25 million. And if we then take that 1.25 million and add it to our 502,000 from kind of the cost of just being a consumer, we're looking at $1.75 million to be a woman. That is absolutely insane. And to me, just shows why women have less wealth than men because of all of these things. 1.75 million over the course of her life in lost wages, in lost wage benefits, in the cost of simply existing. And I really do think like if we were to shift some of these things and get rid of kind of some of the really challenging and big costs and prices of being a woman and existing, we would see more equitable wealth globally. And I think when women have more money, I think honestly, the world will be a better place. I think wealth in women's hands will absolutely change the world because women like to have impact. They will take that money and take care of their families, and they will give back to their communities, and they will become angel investors and reinvest into other women-owned businesses. We know there's a gap there too. VC funding, 2.3% goes to women, and that's white women. And I think it's something like 0.3% go to women of color. And so we have to start to talk about these things and shift the narrative around these being acceptable, because women are losing out on close to $2 million over the course of their lifetime, just on the things I've listed here today. And I'm sure that there's some that I'm missing. So if you think of another one, I would love to hear from you. And I would encourage you to send that my way so I can definitely look into even more of the costs associated with being a woman. So what can we do about this? I'm torn, and how I've structured my book is obviously there's like things we can do individually. I don't think it's on women to change this though. There's things we can advocate for within our companies. And if you're a leader listening to this, I think you have the unique opportunity to make some of those changes in your workplace. And then, of course, I think there's like the policy side of things. So how we vote, who we vote for, what policies our elected officials are advocating for, what bills they're putting forward. Those types of things are also really important. But if you're sitting here being like, oh my God, $2 million, how am I ever going to navigate that? How am I ever going to retire? One of the things that we can do is negotiating and investing. Those are two things that are so crucial to women's economic empowerment. So negotiating your salary, we miss out on probably close to $1 million in salary if we don't negotiate. And that's either person, right? It's men, it's women. If you don't negotiate, it's costing you money, and your companies expect you to negotiate. So if you're listening to this, it's time to negotiate your salary. I get that it can be uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable for 20 minutes, and you might walk out with a $10,000 raise. And so if you haven't yet, go back and listen to the episode I did with Fotini for all of your negotiation tips and tricks. And then investing is so crucial. Women tend to keep their money in cash more often than their male counterparts because they're scared of the market. And I will do an episode on investing for sure. But I think that investing is one of the best ways that we can build our wealth and make our money work for us. Because when we don't invest our money, again, this is not gender specific, we're missing out on $1 million there too. So invest that money, make it work for you. Take your money seriously and start learning about investing if you haven't. And if you are investing and you're not getting 8 to 10% returns per year, you need to take a hard look at your portfolio and try and figure out what's going on. And, there are lots of great financial creators and experts that you can talk to. Sometimes you will go to someone who is biased. And I think everyone has bias. But what's really important is understanding how people are compensated so that you can understand what their bias is. So if you walk into a bank like I did when I was 19 and they stick you in a mutual fund that you have no idea about, they don't take time to explain it to you, and you don't realize that the fee is 2.5% on that mutual fund, know that they're getting compensated based on the fund that they sell you. So the higher the fee, the more money they make. Whereas someone who does not sell investments, so someone like myself, I do not sell investments. I sell education. I teach women how to invest. That is what I teach in my masterminds, in my investment course, the Wealth Lab. We are coming from a place of education, so you would pay a fee to access that information. But then while you're working through the material, you are coming to learn about investments in a non-biased way. We're really just working on finding the investment that's going to give you the best return and be in alignment with your goals. And that is what I wish for all women, is that they understand their investment portfolio. They know that a 2.5% fee or a 2% fee is going to cost them $300,000 over the course of their life. And so these are small things that we can do to kind of take back our power when it comes to our money, and investing and negotiating are two of the best ways that you can do that. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it was a little bit doom and gloom that it costs $2 million to be a woman, but there are things that we can do. So again, individually, we can learn to negotiate and invest. And those are two things that I wish for every single woman to be able to do. Within our organizations, we can advocate for policy. If you're a leader, again, you have the unique opportunity to change policy and make policies more supportive to parents and women. And then how you vote also matters. We should have legislation across Canada that bans things like the pink tax and makes it so that you have to report your gender wage gap and that you have to have salary transparency. But again, there has to be those mechanisms of accountability. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode, and I hope it gives you a lot to think about. I hope it lights a fire under you so that you take your financial independence seriously. Because again, I totally believe that more wealth in women's hands will change the world, and I want you to be a part of that. So I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Pink Tax Podcast, and I'll see you next week. And that's a wrap on this week's episode of The Pink Tax. Thank you for joining me on the front lines of financial fairness. Remember, understanding the cost of being a woman is just the start. Now it's time to demand your worth and build your wealth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a step in dismantling systemic inequality and securing your financial future. If this episode sparked a fire in you, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and share it with a friend who needs to join the movement. Until next time, keep your wallet guarded, your eyes open, and let's keep fighting for a world where pink is just a color, not a tax bracket.